Good afternoon. My name is Adrienne Carter-Sowell, and I have the privilege of introducing our final speaker for the session, and that's Laura Bennett Cattaneo. She's an associate professor of psychology at George Mason University, earned her doctorate in clinical and community psychology from the University of Maryland, College Park in 2001. She joined the faculty of George Mason University in 2003, where she won awards for teaching excellence and community-engaged scholarship, and continues to do so. Dr. Cattaneo applies a community of psychology orientation to her work, centering on the ways psychology can help to address social problems. Dr. Cattaneo's work has focused on key constructs of empowerment, resilience, and survivor-centered practice. And she collaborates with organizations who serve survivors of intimate partner violence in order to define, document, and teach best practices. And she's a founding member of a multidisciplinary effort in the District of Columbia, which aims to create an evidence base to support the work of domestic violence service providers there. Dr. Cattaneo also focused broadly on facilitating the empowerment and resilience of marginalized populations, and she intertwines her research, teaching, mentorship, and service in that work. With a grant from the Spencer Foundation, Dr. Cattaneo has begun to explore the ways in which community-based learning can promote students' understanding of commitment to solving social issues. She's also a trained instructor in Incite, a program that brings together college students and incarcerated students as classmates inside a correctional institution. In research and teaching, Dr. Cattaneo prioritizes partnership with community organizations to inform and share her work, and she has published widely in outlets such as the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, Psychology of Violence, American Journal of Orthopsychiatry, American Journal of Community Psychology, and the American Psychologist. And today she's going to speak to us about her work and her projects. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking the awards committee. It's hard for me to imagine an award I'd be happier to get than a teaching award from SPSSI. So thank you. I know it doesn't come without a workload, and I appreciate it. So I have been teaching at George Mason in Fairfax, Virginia for 15 years. But it wasn't until about halfway through that time that I my career path evolved to bring teaching to the center. So I thought I would, because career paths can go forward in so many ways, and that's one of the beautiful things about an academic career, is that freedom to evolve. I thought I would talk a little bit about my trajectory to this point, and then a few key elements of my teaching philosophy as it currently stands, and then where I'm going from here. So while teaching has not always been at the center of my career in terms of thinking about how things come together, I've always loved teaching. And so I thought this was a safe place to really engage in some nerd glory and just embrace it. I love the intellectual exercise of teaching. I always have since I was a graduate student. I love boiling down the content, figuring out the different threads of it, connecting it to student experience, watching the dynamics in the room as students discover things, and you sort of have to move around to facilitate growth. So the intellectual exercise of teaching has always been a love of mine, and I love to discover that it's also present in one-on-one mentoring. And so it's always been one of my favorite parts of what I do. But when I first got to Mason in 2003, I was very overwhelmed by the prospect of getting tenure. And so while I hope I didn't half-ass it, like Thea was talking about, I did do more of a sort of traditional lecture and exam form of teaching classes. I would sprinkle social justice stuff in everything that I taught because that's the way that my mind works. But I really didn't bring it to the center and intentionally create courses that were about social justice until I got tenure. And that was not a great fit with really who I am and why I got into psychology. I got into psychology because I'm interested in social justice and what psychology has to lend. It was actually your third question, which is the one that got me into this career path to begin with. I'm interested in what psychology has to say about and contribute to social justice, and that's what my scholarship has always been, in my community-based work, but my teaching was sort of on the side. So after I got tenure, I took a minute to think about what I wanted to do next, and created a class that has really become sort of the center of my career path. That wasn't what I thought I was doing when I created the class. When I created the class, oh, this is the center of the career path slide. Isn't this cool? This is a website, Teachers for Social Justice, that I didn't know existed until I was Googling. Okay, so this class. So I was trying to do a couple of things. One is that I wanted to develop a course that had a community-based aspect to it, where I actually had students out in the community. The second was that I wanted to create a course where the explicit objective was to help students see that social issues are social. I had discovered in my years working with undergraduates that when social issues would come up in class, poverty, crime, substance abuse, any of the perennial issues that are with us generation after generation, students would still see them as the result of individual people making bad choices. And while individual people make bad choices all the time, that is not the reason why these social issues are with us and with particular groups of people disproportionately generation after generation, right? Preaching to the choir. So I wanted to develop a class that was really about that rather than trying to cram that in around the edges. And then the last thing I wanted to do is that I didn't want to preach to the choir. So I developed a class that met a graduation requirement. It's called a synthesis class at Mason. It's basically a class that pulls together multiple disciplines. I created it that way on purpose so that I would get sort of unsuspecting students to walk in through the door who didn't already agree with what I was going to say. So basically the way that the class works, I'll just give you a quick overview so that you have a sense of the content of it. So I did sort of a simplified, adapted version of Bronfenbrenner's ecological model and call it the multi-level model. This is it. It basically suggests that people exist within context, right? So when you talk about something like poverty, you can think about how it's experienced at the individual level, you can think about how it's experienced at the interpersonal level, and then you can think about all of the contextual influences that cause and perpetuate it. And so in the class, we begin by teaching the general idea of a multi-level model. And then throughout the semester, we spend most of our time with the case study of poverty. And we talk about poverty at each of these levels. And then at the end of the semester, students do a final project where they apply this model to a social issue that concerns them. During the semester, students also do 20 hours of service at a community organization that serves clients who are experiencing poverty. And we design those placements so that students have direct contact with the clients who are served in the organization. So that's the general content of what happens in the class. I love teaching this class, but what took it from just a class that I really enjoy, because it's challenging and rewarding and energizing and all of that, and sort of amped it up to something that's really become a focus in my career is two things. One is my awesome graduate students, two of whom are sitting right there. To my delight, my graduate students were really interested in this class. From the very beginning, Jenna Kelton is not depicted there, but she is a graduate student who had the nerve to graduate, or she'd be in the picture, who was also involved in the beginning of the class. So we've developed over time a model where my graduate students in the first year in their program, in our program, they will TA the class. And then they go on to teach it themselves and sometimes TA for each other. And so because they were immersed in it and into it, it became sort of a central thing going on in our lab. We would talk about the teaching challenges. We began to write about it, which we've continued to do, and generated research questions. And so here is kind of a overarching research question that's become a driving kind of thought stream in our lab. So here we are at a university with a lot of people who are at key developmental points in their lives. So what can we do from where we are? Well, we can think about how we're contributing to their development, right? So how do we create the kind of citizens who will populate a just world? How can our coursework contribute to that? I was lucky enough to get a grant from the Spencer Foundation to evaluate the impact of the class. And that was a 3-year longitudinal grant. And so my grad students not only were teaching the class, but then we were all also involved in developing a project and collecting data over time and looking at those data together. So it's really become sort of a central task and a thought project in the lab. So now that it's become a thought project and a central thing going on in my work life, it's become clear to me that a teaching philosophy has evolved out of that, and then other classes that have sort of benefited from it. And I just want to talk about a few of those key things and the inspiration that went into them. So, Dr. Martin Luther King talked about creative maladjustment, and where I came across this turn of phrase was actually in a speech he made to APA very shortly before he was killed. I don't know if people have heard this, but he talks about creative maladjustment by saying that in psychology, maladjustment is a bad thing, right? But there are some things in this world to which we should never become adjusted. And then he names them. And he also talks about this as a sort of divine discontent, which I love as well. But as soon as I came across this turn of phrase, I really grabbed onto it. And I don't know if you noticed in the prior slide, we like tattooed it on our wall. That's our lab. Yeah, I know. And he says at the end of his speech, it's time for the creation of a new international organization, the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. So I love both pieces of this term. The first is, the second is really the easy one, right? And I love how Gloria Steinem says it, right? Maladjustment is sort of the easy part. Being upset and uncomfortable with what you see going on around you. Well, I'm sort of an angsty person, so that's really easy for me. But it's also sort of easy to do when you teach, right? I mean, you can put information in front of students that will make them uncomfortable with what's going on in the world around them. It's the creative part where you don't fall down in a hole of depression and wallow, but instead get energized and fueled by that discontent that's tricky. And one of the strategies that we've found in the lab and then also in the classroom is to name that. And I've discovered there's all this wonderful terminology and writing around this out in the scholarly world as I've gotten into the research on this topic, on social justice pedagogy, discovered all of these ways of talking about this. So the pedagogy of discomfort, which I love, there's a paper that talks about if people haven't felt uncomfortable, then they probably haven't learned what you're trying to teach them. And so at the very beginning of the semester, we really define these terms for students, and then we refer back to them as the semester goes on. So if students feel uncomfortable in their volunteer placement, if they start to feel uncomfortable about information that's being presented to them in class, they have a way to talk about it, and they're less likely to sort of just skirt around it or hide from it. So we found that really useful in the classroom. Okay. Second key component of the teaching philosophy that's emerged for me is this idea that teachers are architects of experience. I heard that at a conference at some point. I'm so impressed that you know the name of everyone who's ever inspired you. I wish I knew who this person was. I don't remember, but thank you to that person. So teachers are architects of experience, and that's really something that goes around and around in my head all semester long when I'm planning a class, but all semester long. You know, if you hit an obstacle, it's okay, what do students need to experience right now in order to sort of shake something loose or make something clear? The obvious way that comes up in the class that I've been telling you about is the placement that they have out in the community. So we design those placements very intentionally, we get feedback on them, and we try to make sure that students are having a particular kind of experience out in the community. But equally important, of course, is what's happening in the classroom. So this is just an example of one interactive exercise that we do. It's a game called Spent. It's an online thing. It takes like 20 minutes, and they start with a certain amount of money at the beginning of the month, and they have to make it to the end of the month, and different things happen to them. It's a really great way to define survival-focused coping for students. And there's lots of other things. Actually, giving a talk tomorrow if you want to know more specific strategies, or you can just email me and I'll send you everything. So there's lots of stuff that we do inside the classroom, and then there's the exercises that you have students do on their own, which can also be really powerful because you're not staring at them while they're doing it. A last key component that I think about a lot in my teaching is the idea of shifting the frame, and I know exactly where this came from. So my most powerful frame shifting, really first frame shifting experience as a student came from being exposed to Jean Kilbourne, all aware of who Jean. She's been doing what she does since like the 70s. And it's actually sort of depressing to me that she's still having to talk about the same things. But basically what she talks about is the images of women in advertising. And she makes films of herself lecturing. They're incredibly compelling. So you walk in, you watch one of these films, and when you walk out, you can't look at the imagery that you're bombarded with every day the same way again. That's a frame shift, right? Because you're bombarded with this stuff all the time. So I think about this in my teaching, both during the semester and as I'm developing classes, what's the frame that I want to shift? And I think it's really important, if you go back to the idea of discomfort, to think about not just loosening up the frame that students walk in with, but what are you giving them instead? What are some of the ideas that you're helping them hook this new sense of the world onto, because of that creative part, right? You can't just sort of leave them flailing and now nothing I thought was true is true anymore, or something I really wanted to be true isn't true. So the multi-level analysis is one way of doing this. Essentially, it's a zoom out, right? I'm saying that where psychology in particular and lots of people in general think about just what the individual is or isn't doing, we need to zoom out and ask ourselves about context. So we do that over and over again during the semester. There's also nothing quite so wonderful as a really good metaphor. I should put my nerd thing back up. I love a good metaphor. And I just want to share this one. I'm almost done. So I came across a book a little while ago by Chuck Collins. It's called Born on Third Base. You want to know this book? So he is the great-grandson of Oscar Mayer. And he writes about wealth inequality from the perspective of the 1%. He actually gave up all his money. It's a really interesting, great book, different perspective. But anyway, he writes a chapter on privilege, which is a great chapter, very accessible. And he starts with this story of him taking a bike ride when he's on vacation. And he gets on his bike, and he's going, and he's feeling like a total badass. Look at me, I'm in such good shape. I'm going mile 20. He's like, I better turn around. He turns around, he starts to head back, and he's going into a headwind. And within a few miles, he's like off his bike's in the grass. He has to call a friend to come and pick him up. He's totally humiliated. And it's the greatest analogy for privilege, because the reason I love it and the reason it works so well for students is that he was pedaling, right? It's not that he wasn't expending any effort. He probably is in decent shape, and he did go 20 miles, but the wind was at his back and he didn't know it. So yes, you're expending effort, but it's easy to not know the wind is at your back, and if you turned around, the wind was in your face, you wouldn't be going as far. So it's, again, in a frame shift, if you have a really good metaphor like that, it'll come back all semester long as people hook different things onto it. So in terms of the future, one of the pressing social issues of our time, mass incarceration, something I've been thinking a lot about, what I can do from where I am. And I've sort of gotten involved in there's lots of people doing wonderful things around bringing students in and bringing education into incarcerated populations. The Incite Out Prison Exchange Program is one that brings college students into either a jail or a prison, and you teach a blended class with students who are incarcerated, and the content of the class is all critical dialogue, so it's not lecture. But it's critical dialogue across differences. And so I've gotten trained in that, and I'm now working on bringing that to Mason as part of a minor in social justice and mass incarceration. So that is the way I'm keeping myself uncomfortable these days, and looking forward to many more years of the same. So thank you very much.